Like to talk about FAIR principles for good data management, and I want to explore how current interoperability practices in healthcare facilitate the adoption of FAIR principles and what are the challenges. Let's first explain what is FAIR. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Creating data sets are challenging and time consuming. We put lots of resource efforts to collect this data, and we don't want to just use once and forget about them. Integrating different data sets, using them in different contexts, will enable us to support data-driven medicine, having more research results, better outcomes. Therefore, the FAIR principles is important in healthcare domain. FAIR principles sets a guideline for how to achieve findability, accessibility, and interoperability goals for research data sets and how to ensure that they are reusable. They also have specific focus on machine actionability. So we want to reduce the workload on mans and enable that machines can take some task on behalf of us. Actually, reuse of the data is not new for the healthcare community. Uh, Maybe more than 2 decades, we are working on secondary use of health data. If we look the definition of the secondary use, information collected in course of providing care being used for purposes other than direct patient care. This might include research, quality assurance, patient safety, planning of services, epidemiology, or innovation of new algorithms and methods. We are all aware of the potentials of the secondary use. We can study different diseases, we can merge those population groups, we can examine social factors, environmental factors in different diseases. If we reuse patient data together with healthcare data, and we can develop predictive models for personalized medicine. When we reuse the data, data becomes less expensive, it takes less time to complete a study, and we can identify large populations and samples. Then how these FAIR principles can help us and how we can achieve these FAIR principles in our healthcare settings. Let's give me a guided tour on this four different principles. First one is the findability. Our first problem is we want to find the data sets. Where are they? Because sometimes it's very difficult to know a data set exists at all. The principle suggests us we should globally, uniquely identify data sets with an identifier, and we should create a descriptive data, metadata around this data, such as what is the study about, who conducted this study, and so we can, when we search for this data set, we can find them and they should be registered and indexed in searchable resources. In healthcare domain, we have many data repositories. This is an advantage for us. We have studies, clinical trials, we have disease registries, we have different collections such as dbGaP, eMERGE, TCGA, and we also have federations of those studies and collections such as HMO Research Network. But what are the challenges? When we are describing these data sets with metadata, it's very difficult to estimate from this description this data sets fits for your purpose for reuse. Most of the time, there are very limited description about this data sets, such as primary diagnosis, sometimes admitted drugs. But if you are looking for a specific phenotype, such as specific age group or specific secondary diagnosis, you don't know if you have this data in that data set before you get it. And also, those data sets mostly is not indexed, and when you search it, it's very difficult to discover them. You have to have someone advising you there's a good repository in here or there. And we don't have unique identifiers to identify these data sets. So one study data might appear more than one collection, and if we are collecting data from multiple collections, you have duplications. Second aspect is the accessibility. Well, like once we identify the data with their identifier, we want to have a standard open protocols to access this data. So if I want to get this data, how I'm going to apply? And when I get this data, can I understand this data format? Can I work with that data format? It shouldn't be any additional barrier to access this data itself. In healthcare domain, like when you look on those repositories, we have manual application procedures. Luckily, we have community standards for many data formats, such as DICOM. So when we have the data, we know how to work with this data. The problem areas is coming with this ethical approval. They cannot really be automated. Like each time, like we have to go through this ethical approval processes for this data reuse. Our second challenge is, since we are working with sensitive data, it should be anonymized. And that makes record linkage is almost impossible or very challenging. Actually, we are losing lots of information because like we cannot really link those data sets and work in all of them. Third point is interoperability. Once you have the data, you should be able to work with this data. You should be able to understand what is this data about, semantically and syntactically, and also integrate those data sets. Yeah, we talked about HL7. There are also other standards, OMAP. We have open EHR archetypes, as we mentioned. We have terminologies, vocabularies, SNOMED, ICD, ORFA codes. All this makes our life somehow easier because we have vocabularies and terminology standards to define the semantic meaning of the data. But also sometimes it might be difficult to have that many of standards, and sometimes they are not really transferable to each other. It's very difficult to create mappings between those concepts. If you are using data set created in two different standards, it's always a big challenge to map them into each other. Last part is the reusability. In here, the question is like, I want to reuse this data in another context than it is produced. So what do I need? Like having the data, the understanding of the data is not enough. I need to have legal and ethical permissions to use this data in another context. So that is the most important challenge we are facing in healthcare domain, since our all data is personal, since all of them are sensitive, we need consent. And consent is always not possible for a future study. You just get consent for the specific study that you are carrying on. Then like how are you gonna transfer this consent to the future's reuse is a very challenging problem, and it creates a big barrier on reusability of this data sets. So if you consider this data sharing and all these problems around the sensitive data, if we cannot really share this sensitive data, how can we reuse it? Is it really possible to reuse this data, even it's fully findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? The classical way of reusing data goes by sharing of data. Either you collect data in a central repository and let others to examine this data and work with this data, or just give this data away to a third party. However, there is another way to deal with this data sharing. What we can do, rather than bringing data into a central place and let others to work on that, we can write algorithms, we can write analytic tasks, and we can bring those algorithms to the data. That's the GoFair personal health train approach we are following uh, in our work. With our colleagues from the Netherlands and from Germany and Sweden, we are working on creating implementations of this algorithm sharing and improving the reusability of health data with FAIR principles. So just giving a brief idea about what is the difference between centralized and distributed analytics. As I mentioned, in centralized analytics, you put all your data into a location. Our metaphor of trains, rather than having in a single location, you can create a train of algorithms. And this train can visit each data center. It can be a hospital, it can be a research facility. And if you are having a statistical model, or if you are sending some queries to count patients, they can work in each station one by one. Do not share the data, then go to the next one, work again, and aggregate the results, train the models, and only share the aggregated outcomes with researcher. Then it's a way to overcome this data reusability and shareability problem. One advantage of this approach, you can work with many standards and many programming languages. What happens? Researchers looks for metadata about where are the data sources, what are the stations that I can use. By using this rich metadata description, they write their own algorithms. They encapsulate with a metadata to describe what is this algorithm about. Then each data station can decide to run or do not run these algorithms. They write their queries and analytic tasks, and we containerize it. Those containers travels from one station to other station, and whatever the data standard specified in that station, it could be a fire, or it can be a DICOM for image analytics, or it can be I2B3 instance. They can interact, they can access the data, and leave only with these trained models, not with the data. We apply this personal health train approach in many settings, including cancer registry, rare diseases, radiomics. In Germany, we are working on rare diseases and polypharmacy. Our Dutch colleagues working on with cancer data and with radiomics. We already got very good results. I will little bit speed up. What does it mean applying this personal health train approach? Do we need to still care about being fair? Definitely yes, and maybe more than data sets. We should definitely describe data as a fair data sets, enrich with these ontologies. We should have our stations in accessible protocols, and we should have trains described with the rich metadata and in a reusable manner. If you like to learn a little bit more about this Go Fair and our implementation network, here are the links. It is an open environment for innovation, so everyone can contribute and everyone can be a member. And I would like to encourage you to take a look at into that. And yes, here comes the end of my presentation. Probably we will have the questions at the end. Thank you for listening.